I'm interested as to whether you think this is an ongoing pushback because of, well, the tech issues that we've seen, the rivalry between US and China, or is it something different entirely?
Well, lots of layers of intrigue here, of course. Now, any multinational corporation operating in China knows that there is always the risk of tax and compliance audits. This runs from technology to retail, really across the gamut. But in this geopolitical climate, of course, whenever these moves are taken, there's always the question of whether there's more of a political tinge here of economic coercion. And of course, Foxconn being so closely tied to Apple, is more of a question mark here in terms of targeting. There have been rumors of informal bans against Apple products. This comes in the wake of revelations around Huawei's breakthrough, making it a more formidable competitor to Apple as well. So lots of different things to untangle here. Other companies also facing crackdowns from China's data security laws. But there's a bit more to unpack here on whether this is truly a case for coercion and how it could tie into the Taiwanese election as well.
Yeah, let's dig into that in a moment. Hon Hai Precision Industry, it's the public arm of Foxconn, basically saying they will collaborate with authorities. And indeed, you mentioned this is in some ways to do with reviewing of land use and in particular tax audits. Tell us a little bit more about the added complexity that the founder of Foxconn, or Hon Hai, has stepped down, of course, because he's running for the Taiwanese election.
He is. And of course, that it changes up the race a bit. He's running as an independent. And this is a very complex electoral dynamic for Beijing in trying to favor an outcome for the KMT, which is more friendly to mainland policies. It's hard to conclude, though, that a move against Foxconn would translate into a political favorability toward Beijing when it comes to the upcoming Taiwan election in January. There's a question of whether Terry Gou, his participation in the race, would divide the opposition vote in a way that undermines the KMT, favors the DPP, which Beijing would not like to win. But still, that's a very complex logic chain. And I doubt that these moves against Foxconn would translate into Terry Gou actually pulling back from the race. So, again, I think there's a temptation to see everything as a highly politicized move. But here, I think we need to take a closer look at Apple's diversification moves, other electronics companies and their diversification moves. China, of course, has a very big impulse now to strike back at U.S.-led technology and investment controls. We just had another round of U.S.-led chip controls, which is putting a lot of pressure on major U.S. tech partners to include Taiwan. So that is really, I think, the hypothesis to test here.
When you put, of course, you say it's easy to go for the highly political lens, go for the highly economic lens, because all of this comes in a much tougher context for China more broadly.
Absolutely. So anything perceived as retribution are falling into the scope of tightening laws around counter-espionage and countering any type of perceived espionage activity, crackdowns around data security in general. Multinational corporations are already on high alert, and this certainly doesn't help the souring investment climate. As we've already seen, FDI inflows into China have been leveling off, particularly since 2019. That's been very worrying, to the point where you see the State Council of China putting out all kinds of pledges to say it's okay, we're doing things to promote foreign investment, to include very notable things like easing cross-border flows in data regulations, a big ask for many of these companies. At the same time, every time that the U.S. engages in another round of technology and investment controls, there is this impulse to strike back. And you're seeing this through landmark legislation coming out of China, everything from counter-espionage law, the foreign relations law. It's a form of codifying retribution. And so as we start to see things translate into actions, for example, MOFCOM export controls on artificial and natural graphite. Artificial graphite is a very critical input for EV batteries. We've seen recent restrictions on gallium and germanium exports. Those are important for semiconductor manufacturing. And so all of this only underscores the unreliability of China in these critical value chains. And so that can energize diversification moves. But of course, China's looking to show where it can create pain in the here and now.
And it inflicts pain on its own publicly traded companies. I'm looking at the Star 50 index, which was only conceived of about 3 years ago to really try and be the rival, the Chinese version of the NASDAQ 100, and it's hit a record low since its inception. We are worried about growth concerns. We're worried about global liquidity and a weak export outlook, not to mention some of these political elements to it all. So go back to what you advise clients in the here and now, Reva. Of course, you are someone who lead client engagement for Rhodium's China Corporate Advisory. If I'm about to think about entering the country, do you say I wouldn't?
Well, it depends on where you are, which value chain we're speaking of, even as diversification is happening. You can look at Apple, for example. You can even look at Foxconn's footprint and how it has a notable presence in China, but emerging presence in places like India, Mexico, Vietnam. So that trend is happening, of course, but these companies are also greatly exposed, Apple in particular. And as these companies are engaged in this balancing act, it is very important to understand the intent behind China's policy moves. It's caught between trying to promote a healthier foreign investment climate to counteract the forces of its structural economic downturn. And, that is something that is going to last for a while. At the same time, to stay alert to U.S.-led and partner moves on technology and investment controls. This is a fast-evolving space. There is a lot packed into for example, the 400-some pages of controls that came out just last week from the U.S. that is making it very hard for technology companies in particular at the leading edge to continue operating in China. You only have to look at a company like Samsung, for example, to see how actively they are diversifying outside of China already. So lots of moves in play. Balancing acts are hard to pull off in this geopolitical climate, but really depends on where you have a credible competitor in the Chinese space, where you're at the leading edge, and where other opportunities lie outside of China.